Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 810 for March 15th, 2020. Back home from New Zealand and coronavirus-free for now. Coming up in a few minutes.
I had hilarious conversations with the health service executive. There was a lady for 2 weeks who was trying to convince me that I was obliged to mature my whiskey in stainless steel because it was a food product. And I spent 2 weeks convincing her that that was not the case. And then I spent another 2 weeks convincing her that the tasting notes on the back of my bottle didn't mean that I added peppercorns or lime into my whiskey. It was pretty difficult.
Louise McGuane is shaking up the Irish whiskey industry, and by the scruff of the neck at times. She's a former Diageo executive who left the spirits giant several years ago to return to her hometown in County Clare, Ireland, and has been trying to revive the tradition of Irish whiskey bonding ever since. That has led to roadblocks along the way, both from government and from within the Irish whiskey industry. Louise McGuane gave a TED Talk of sorts during the recent World Whisky Forum in Seattle, and we'll have it on WhiskyCast in depth. That's just ahead, along with a calendar of events that's getting lighter by the day. Your voice, and on Behind the Label, we'll look at how some distilleries are trying to help us cope with the coronavirus crisis. Grab your hand sanitizer and scrub up. It's time for this week's WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. And we have to start off with the story that has the world on edge this week, the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. If you are planning a whiskey trip this spring, well, save your money. You'll need it for hand sanitizer anyway. That's because most distilleries have now gone on lockdown status when it comes to visitors in an attempt to protect the health of their workers and keep production going. Seattle has been one of the major hotspots for the virus in North America, and Westland Distillery decided this week to extend the shutdown of its tasting room and gift shop until at least March 27th. Virtually all of Kentucky's major distilleries have closed down visitor centers and tour operations. That includes Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, Four Roses, and Heaven Hill, which is also closing its Evan Williams Bourbon Experience in downtown Louisville. Beam also closed the Jim Beam Urban Still House in Louisville, and Brown-Forman has also shut down public facilities at the Jack Daniel Distillery in Tennessee. Diageo has shut down tours at its distilleries in Tennessee and Kentucky, along with the Roe & Co. distillery in Ireland. For now, though, its 12 distilleries in Scotland that are open to the public remain so. That could change at any time. Irish officials have ordered severe restrictions on large indoor gatherings, and that prompted almost all of Ireland's distilleries to close their doors to tourists just days before St. Patrick's Day celebrations. What's more, Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has now called on all bars and public houses in Ireland to close voluntarily through March 29th. That follows what the government referred to as, quote, reckless behavior by certain members of the public in certain pubs Saturday night. The closings, once again, are voluntary, but government officials will be monitoring compliance and could seek legal authority to take tougher steps. Distillery visitor centers and tours are also shut down until the end of the month or when Irish health officials decide that it's safe to reopen. Teeling Whiskey Company's Jack Teeling told us in an email that closing to the public will mean a large financial hit during a traditionally very busy time. but he hopes that it's the right decision for the safety of our staff and visitors. Dublin Liberty's distillery manager Daryl McNally called the coronavirus pandemic one of the biggest things to hit a generation. The announcements came while Irish Whiskey Association leaders were on a week-long tour in the U.S., which remains the largest single market for Irish whiskey worldwide. They're promoting the new Irish Whiskey 360 campaign in conjunction with Irish tourism officials. Last year, more than 1 million people visited distilleries and whiskey-related attractions in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. The campaign is starting off with a website that lets tourists plan distillery visits, according to Irish Whiskey Association President William Lavelle.
If you're planning your trip to Ireland and you'd like to visit 2, 3, 4 distilleries, you'll be able to do this in one place, book your tickets, and actually get an incentive if you book more than one. So this is a long-term project. We're very proud to get it off the ground. We're very happy to get support from the Irish tourism agencies. And really, we just want to raise awareness. Now, obviously, the big elephant in the room is the threat of coronavirus. So, look, we don't know for how long this crisis is going to continue. But look, Irish Whiskey 360 is a long-term campaign. We're only starting out with our website and our media activity. We're going to be building on that initiative over the next 2 years. So yeah, we're going to be here long after the corona pandemic has passed. We'll be here growing Irish whiskey.
Let's run through a few more distilleries that have shut down visitors' operations. In addition to Wild Turkey in Kentucky, Campari is ending tours and gift shop operations for at least the next 2 weeks at its 40 Creek Distillery in Grimsby, Ontario, and Glen Grant Distillery in Scotland. William Grant & Sons has closed visitor centers at all of its distilleries worldwide, including Glenfiddich and the Balvenie in Scotland and Tullamore Dew in Ireland. Inverhouse has done the same at Balblair, Old Pulteney, Knockdew, and Balmenic distilleries, and Brown-Forman is doing likewise at Glendronach, Benriach, and Glenglassaugh distilleries. Those are just a few. We will update our stories at whiskycast.com as we get more confirmations. The coronavirus outbreak has also forced a lot of event cancellations and postponements. The latest one came Sunday night, just as we were recording this week's episode. The Nth, scheduled for April 23rd and 24th in Las Vegas, has been canceled completely. It's been rescheduled for April of 2021. The Wynn Resort will provide refunds for hotel reservations, but event tickets will still be honored next year. Elsewhere, Whiskey and Barrel Night this Thursday night in New York City has been postponed. City and state officials there have banned large public events for at least the next month. Organizers are hoping to reschedule it for later this spring, along with Whiskey and Barrel Night in Washington, D.C., that was scheduled for April 17th. Whiskey Fest Chicago has been postponed until December 11th, and the inaugural Whiskey Fest meets Big Smoke Festival, scheduled for April 3rd and 4th in South Florida, is being rescheduled for a new date. The Whiskey Festival Noord-Nederland in the Netherlands has been canceled completely, along with the wonderful World of Whiskey show in Cornwall, Ontario. This week's Whiskey Live in Tel Aviv, Israel, has been postponed until at least May, while Whiskey Magazine still plans to go ahead with Whiskey Live London at the end of the month. That's based on the current UK government advice that, quote, people should go about their business as usual. Now, that is the current advice from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's administration. However, Scottish government officials are taking a tougher stance, with a ban on events with attendance of more than 500 people starting this week. We're about 6 weeks away from the start of the Spirit of Speyside Festival, which has already sold thousands of tickets for around 700 different events, starting April 30th. Festival Chairman James Campbell told us by email that they will follow government advice to the letter, but they do hope to still be able to stage the festival this year. Organizers of the Islay Festival of Malt and Music are calling an emergency meeting in the wake of the Scottish government's decision. Their festival does not get underway until May 22nd, but with thousands of people planning to descend on Islay for the week, there could be a serious impact on the island's health and transportation services. The Scottish government is expected to issue more guidance on its ban early this week. Festival organizers say they'll have announcements as soon as possible. Obviously, this is a fast-moving situation, and we will keep you updated as things develop during the week on our social media feeds and at the WhiskyCast website. In other news now, funeral services were held Saturday on Islay for Duncan McGillivray, who worked at Bruichladdich for 40 years. He started out as an apprentice back in 1974, and when Bruichladdich was brought out of mothballs in 2001, it was his job to keep the place running on a shoestring budget. I spoke with Duncan when he retired in June of 2014.
Well, that was the best thing that ever happened. A lot of people say to me that it was quite a dark day when Bruichladdich closed, which it was. But I'm a great believer in the fact that everything's for a reason, and had that not happened, we wouldn't be standing here chatting today, would we?
Duncan McGillivray had been in failing health for the last several years. He died Tuesday at the age of 68. Please join us in sending our condolences to his wife Susan, his daughters Donna, Helen, and Jenny, and all of his friends at Bruichladdich. Also from Islay, Ardbeg distillery manager Mickey Heads announced this week that he'll be retiring later this year. He's been the manager at Ardbeg for the last 13 years and will stay active with the distillery as chairman of the Ardbeg Committee Affinity Group for at least the next 3 years. His colleagues say the search for a successor is underway, so get your CVs updated. However, I suspect Glenmorangie Company executives have been planning for this day sooner or later and have a few internal candidates in mind. Still, it never hurts to apply. We do have one more management change to report, this one from Sweden, where Mackmyra CEO Magnus Dandenell is stepping aside. He's been the CEO at Mackmyra since 1999 when the distillery opened. He'll stay on with Mackmyra in a business development role. Johan Larsson is the new CEO. He's worked with a number of Swedish consumer goods companies in the past, in addition to being a Mackmyra shareholder. Turning now to politics for a minute, and a bit of positive news for Scotch whisky makers and their colleagues elsewhere in the UK. The British government did not quite give whisky makers the excise duty cut they were hoping for in Chancellor Rishi Sunak's budget address to Parliament Wednesday. Instead, they got the next best thing, a freeze in duty on all alcoholic beverages for the next year, along with £10 million in research and development funding to help develop new systems for reducing carbon emissions at distilleries, and additional support for export promotion programs. In addition, the government renewed its pledge to conduct a complete review of alcohol taxation with an eye to equalizing rates for spirits, beer, cider, and wine. The Chancellor also promised to keep pushing the Trump administration to remove the 25% tariff on single malts from Scotland and Northern Ireland. That tariff is still having a major impact on Scotch whisky exports to the U.S. As we've reported in recent weeks, the imposition of that tariff last October led to a 25% drop in Scotch whisky shipments to the U.S. for the final 3 months of 2019. We'll get new data near the end of next month on shipments for the first quarter of 2020. Islay's Kilchoman distillery is one of the smaller exporters trying to absorb the impact of the tariffs. Managing Director Anthony Wills and his U.S. importer, Sam Filmus of Impex, agreed last fall to split the cost of the tariffs between them to keep their retail pricing consistent. And Anthony Wills told me the other day they've agreed to keep doing it through the end of this year.
I think the issue really is that people's mindset in America, the consumers and the single malt drinkers, is that the tariffs have been implemented, and if you're holding your price or it's gone up, they seem to have the same view that single malt whiskey has gone up in price. So I think it's going to be a difficult year. We accept that, and we'll see where we are. At the moment, it hasn't really taken effect, but talking to Sam, he says it's tough out there, and it will remain so while these tariffs are in place.
And the distributors, I know, are reluctant to even order single malts right now.
That is true, yeah, and I think that'll be the case. I think everyone's a bit nervous about the whole chain of where you get it out to, and distributors are not keen to hold stock, and then their wholesalers likewise. So it's a very difficult time for everyone involved, and we hope that it won't be in place for much longer.
Trump administration officials decided last month to leave the tariff in place for now, after considering whether to increase it or add whiskeys from more parts of Europe to the list. Those are just a few of the headlines from this week. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. Seems he was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. You can always find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distillery. Of course, with the coronavirus pandemic causing widespread cancellations of events all over the world, please check the website for any event you're thinking of going to in the next few weeks to get the most updated information. For instance, tickets were to go on sale Monday for the Spirit of Toronto Festival, April 25th. With Roy Thompson Hall now closed through the end of this month, ticket sales have been pushed back until April 1st, and contingency plans are in place in case the festival can't be held as scheduled. We also got word this weekend that Whiskey on Ice in Minneapolis, Minnesota, scheduled for this coming Saturday night, has been postponed. There's no word yet on a new date. There are still some events taking place, but once again, double check before you head out. The Scotch Whisky Experience in Edinburgh, Scotland, has its next Scotch Whisky training school this Wednesday, March 18th. Hard to Find Whiskey in Birmingham, England, has an Erin 25th Anniversary Masterclass on Friday the 20th. Our friends at the Lunar Rogue Bar in Fredericton, New Brunswick, are still hosting a Spirit of Speyside Festival Whiskey Awards judging session coming up on March 29th. And Buffalo Trace Distillery is still scheduled to host its Easter at the Trace celebration April 5th in Frankfort, Kentucky, at least for now. Counting all of the postponements, we still have more than 200 different events on our searchable calendar at the WhiskyCast website, and we'll keep updating it as we get word of more changes. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits, including the Roundstone Rye and Rabble Rouser Bottled in Bond Rye whiskeys. They do it all with renewable solar energy, too. In fact, you can actually check in and see how their solar array is doing in real time at their website, CatoctinCreekDistilling.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Here's a special reminder from our friends at Redbreast. If you've ever wanted to visit Ireland, Redbreast wants to make that happen when things get back to normal. They're giving away a 5-day, 4-night trip for two to visit Ireland, and all you have to do is visit redbreastwhiskey.com/Ireland and share your story of landing on Redbreast. The contest runs through March 31st, 2020. Terms and conditions apply. And unfortunately, one of those conditions is that it's only open to U.S. residents. You'll find the complete rules at the Redbreast website. WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlach. Irish whiskey is arguably in its best shape in the last 100 years, with demand growing all over the world. Back when we started WhiskyCast in 2005, there were just 3 distilleries in Ireland, Middleton, Cooley, and Bushmills in Northern Ireland. Today, there are at least 31 operating distilleries, and at least to this point, more being planned for the future. Michael Morris of the Hinch Distillery in Northern Ireland's County Down plans to start distilling in June. In the meantime, Hinch is selling blended whiskey sourced from other distilleries.
For years and years, Irish whiskey internationally would have been seen as the tiny younger brother of Scotch, but this lighter style of whiskey is becoming much more popular. 25 to 35-year-olds around the world are drinking Irish whiskey ahead of Scotch. You also have a new demographic coming in, young women drinking whiskey for the first time. So this is fueling a huge amount of interest in the category.
The consistent growth in demand has helped other fledgling brands build an audience. 2 years ago, we met Sabine Sheehan when Lambay Irish Whiskey made its debut in New York City. I caught up with her this week in Philadelphia, and while the U.S. remains the largest market for Irish whiskey, demand is growing worldwide.
We are proud to say now in 43 markets. Growth is good, 20 global duty-free shops. So we've certainly established a good distribution, particularly in Russia and Asia, which has been surprising. But through the networks of Camus, we've reached good buyers, good retailers, and our duty-free network is certainly supporting our growth.
So when do we see some new Lambays?
Well, I've got a story for you. We've just issued and launched our first single malt, single cask strength in Dubai Duty Free this week. So it's an exclusive cask program, Mark. Only 20 casks will be released worldwide. And they were the casks that we laid down on the island in 2017. So they've had all of that impact from the sea air imparted into the casks. And they are 100% cognac cask finished. And I'm very excited about that. The ABV is from 45 to 59. The client selects from 3 samples we offer them. It's a highly personalised product. They can brand the logo with their company name on it. So it's targeting high-end retailers, duty-free houses, and only 360 bottles per cask. Each batch numbered and signed by the master blender, of course. So it's something quite unique. Hoping to get it into the US for the end of this year. We've got a couple of feelers out there, waiting on that to close. And then in April this year, we're bringing out a new product, a malt in Ireland, but that will hit the US market in 2021.
But it's important to keep things in perspective, even with all of the positive things happening in Irish whiskey. That's where Louise McGuane comes in. The founder of Chapelgate Whiskey Company has been fighting to revive the old tradition of Irish whiskey bonding and butting heads with the establishment on a regular basis. She was once part of that establishment as an executive at Diageo, but decided to return to her roots in County Clare and try to bring Irish whiskey back to its roots as well. During the recent World Whisky Forum in Seattle, Louise McGuane gave a TED Talk of sorts about her recent experiences. Now, if you're not familiar with TED Talks, they're famously limited to 18 minutes maximum, so we won't bring you all of hers, but the first 18 minutes are unedited. And we should note, the opinions are hers exclusively, and not necessarily those of WhiskyCast or the World Whisky Forum.
We in Ireland, unlike most of you in this room, be it Scotch, be it American, Canadian, Japanese, whatever, we actually have a broken tradition of Irish whiskey making. And that's the way that I see it. And there's validity in that because you guys have very, very long histories of making whiskey. You've continuously made it and continuously evolved it and had tradition move along very consistently for 150, a couple of hundred years, or whatever it happens to be. In Ireland, that is not the case. The history of Irish whiskey is a pretty sad one, particularly in the last 150 years or so. So we used to be Irish. We used to be whiskey. Irish whiskey was whiskey. It outsold Scotch. It was, known for its quality. It was drank by kings and queens, and it was exported all over the world. And we were king of the hill for a very long time. And we kind of looked down at Scotland. And then sort of a conflagration of geopolitical circumstance happened, and the entire Irish whiskey over about a 50 to 60 year period just collapsed. And it started due to the fact that the industry was not willing to adapt new technology and to innovate. They rejected the coffee still. Our friends over in Scotland accepted that technology and were able to outproduce us and were able to feed the United States and the British Empire, so they were able to outsell us. Then Ireland's history kind of took over. You know, we had a famine, half the population died or emigrated, a lot of distilleries closed down then. Then we had a very protracted war of independence against the Brits. Then we had a trade war with the Brits, and then we had our own independence. And so from about 1890, or maybe 1880 to 1920, we went from having a couple hundred distilleries on the island to having only 4 or 5 left. That's a very short period of time. At one point in the last century, we had 1 distillery on the island, and the government had to sort of come in and save it. It was really, really dire times. So our tradition is kind of murky. You know, it's been broken up, and we're not really sure exactly what our tradition is necessarily, because there was one or two companies making all of the Irish whiskey in the world for a very, very long period of time. So fortunately, that's changed, and the industry is kind of on the way up. So you have a lot of new people who are coming in like me, and I'm a whiskey bonder, and very specifically what that means in the context of Irish whiskey is that I don't distill, I never will. I source whiskey from multiple distilleries around the island of Ireland. I source casks, I put the spirit and the cask together, I mature it on my family farm, and then when it's ready, I blend it to create my own house style. So where's the tradition of that? I hear you ask. I mean, whiskey bonding in the context of Irish whiskey was a vital part of the industry throughout its entire history. Bonders were all over the island. There was kind of 2 kinds of bonders. The distilleries that were in operation didn't actually bother branding and bottling and maturing themselves, really, a lot of them. They were just kind of producing. They were just producing spirit and selling it to the bonders. There was huge, big bonders up in Dublin who had massive government warehouses, huge, enormous kind of operations, and they were exporting in sloops all over the world, essentially. And then there were very small-scale bonders in pretty much every single town in Ireland. So every town in Ireland, even today, you'll kind of see remnants of this, had mercantile owners or publicans. And they sold everything from Assam tea from India, port, sherry, wine from Bordeaux, dandelion wine, ammunition, gun parts, musical instruments, you name it, they were doing it. And they were also selling whiskey. To make their whiskey, because there was a proliferation of distilleries at the time of their operation, they would just kind of send whatever casks they had lying around their shops, the spent ones possibly, send them off to the local distillery, fill them up, and then very often they would just custom blend whiskies for their individual customers. So in my town of Kilrush, for example, if you were the very wealthy Glynn merchant family or the very wealthy landlord family, the Vandeleurs, you would have had your own housekeeper's blend. And somebody like J.J. Corrie, which is our brand's name, would have made that for you. You know, the housekeeper would have gone in once a month or once a week and picked it up, and he would have custom blended it for her. I mean, this was a pretty common model. It was common in Scotland as well. I think Johnny Walker sort of started off in a similar kind of vein. But within the context of Irish whiskey and our tradition, it had completely died out. And the reason it died out was that it very simply became a victim of the collapse of the industry. When there was only a couple of distilleries left on the island, they cut off the bonders. They decided to control the route to market themselves, and they cut off the bonders. The bonders could no longer secure a supply of whiskey from the distilleries, and they ran out, very simply put. The last bonder on the island of Ireland who was in operation was Mitchell & Sons, who used to make Green Spot whiskey. Prior to, it was ultimately sold on to Pernod, but they were the last kind of holdouts until about 1961, 1959, depending on who you ask. And then that was it. Whiskey bonding was dead. It was dead, it was buried, it was forgotten, it was written out of our tradition and written out of our history until I found that label on the top left there. When I quit my job and decided to move home to Ireland to make whiskey. Of course, I was going to have a grain-to-glass distillery. That's what you do. I have a farm. My dad still farms it. It's a dairy farm. We have land. So I went home and I said, okay, what's the history of distilling locally? What is it? Because we're going to take inspiration from whatever happened here 100 years ago, and we're going to bring it back. It's going to be great. And there was an amazing kind of wall of a distillery left in the town of Kilrush that had closed down because of the famine, and it became a poorhouse, and it was full of history, and it was amazing. And it was covered in asbestos, and would have cost me €4 million to get all the asbestos off before I even started building the distillery. And so I started looking at a lot of other sites. And during my research, I found that label for sale on eBay by an antique dealer whose name was Davok Rin. And he lived in Milltown Malby, which is about maybe 20 minutes up the coast from me. So, listen, I called him up and I said, Davok, what's the story with this label that you're selling for €1 each on eBay? I need to talk to you about this. So I went up to his house, and he had been a prolific antiques dealer in the 1990s and the 1980s as well. And the story behind this label is that he had gotten a call from the Brew family in Kilrush, who had just purchased J.J. Corrie's shop, because J.J. Corrie's daughter, Bridie, had just passed away in 1983. And Bridie had inherited the shop from her dad, who was the whiskey bonder. He had passed away in 1932. And she never married. She just ran the shop and didn't change anything. The shop was exactly the way it was when J.J. kind of started it in the 1890s. And they said to Davok, look, you need to kind of dismantle this shop. It's taking up space. Tear it down on the interior and get rid of it and just clear it out for us and sell what you can. So he dismantled the interior, and he ended up selling it to a local folk park. So we still have the actual interiors of the shop. And he went up into the attic and he found all of this paper ephemera, basically, like these labels, receipts, telegrams, bags, advertisements, all sorts of actual authentic stuff that J.J. Corrie had his hands on and created. So I bought as much of it as I could, obviously, from Davok, basically. And I started and then I started to really kind of ask around to the verbal history locally about the Corrie family. Because, I live in a very small village. It's 300 people, give or take. Half of them are my cousins. And I figured I was probably related to the man. And I started to just ask everybody locally, who were the Corries? That man there in the middle is J.J. Corrie. That is J.J. Corrie's great-great-grand-nephew. He lives 1.5 miles away from me in Clachanbeg, the townland of Clachanbeg. And he was born and still lives in the same house that J.J. Corrie was born in, basically. So then I started to see all this stuff like, okay, JJ, he was importing wine from Bordeaux. He had a port and he marketed it as Invalid Port. And of course he had his own special malts as well. And I realized, forget the grain to glass distillery. We're going to become a whiskey bonder, because it's a lost part of the Irish whiskey, of the heritage of Irish whiskey that was written out of history. And we're in the middle of this amazing resurgence of Irish whiskey. So somebody needs to bring that back. So I decided to do that instead. So when I decided to do that, this was the status of the Irish whiskey industry. There was maybe one more kind of distillery down the bottom, Dingle, but it wasn't really producing yet. So it's really hard to be a whiskey bonder, bearing in mind that we focus on everything after distillation, so maturation and blending, etc., etc. You need a wide library of flavors in order to create unique whiskies, or you're just going to be blending the same three things all over and over and over again. So when I started off, when I had the idea, that was the status of the Irish whiskey industry. This is it as of December 2019. So depending on who you ask, there's anything between 25 to 30 distilleries in operation or planning or production around Ireland. And this has happened very, very, very quickly. We're at the same point that you guys were in America in the craft distilling boom about 15 years ago, I think. And one of the questions that Dave posed was kind of around legislation. And what does that, how does that help or hinder you? And when you have an industry growing as fast as from that to that in 5 years maybe, legislation becomes very important very fast, obviously. But my opinion of it is that it can kind of help and hinder. So with us in Irish whiskey, traditionally, we didn't really have any definitions necessarily. We didn't have a fancy Scotch Whisky Association to kind of guide us down a path because we didn't need it, because we only had 3 distilleries ticking along, basically. But when all the new guys came in, suddenly it became very apparent that legislation was needed. And for me personally, setting up the whiskey bonding industry, or bringing that back, I've found legislation to be difficult at times. When I was setting up my bonded warehouse on the farm, nobody had done that in living memory in the revenue office, and they couldn't really help me. And I had hilarious conversations with the health service executive. There was a lady for 2 weeks who was trying to convince me that I was obliged to mature my whiskey in stainless steel because it was a food product. And I spent 2 weeks convincing her that that was not the case. And then I spent another 2 weeks convincing her that the tasting notes on the back of my bottle didn't mean that I added peppercorns or lime into my whiskey. It was pretty difficult. So legislation can kind of help and hinder. We have what's called the Irish Whiskey Technical File, which is a bit of a controversial document in Ireland, depending on who you talk to. It's very, very good in that it protects Irish whiskey, finally. So technically, you can't make Irish whiskey in China or in France because we have a geographical indicator that protects us, essentially. The problem from a legislative standpoint on this is that when this document was written, you just had, this is who was making whiskey on the island. So these guys all got together in a room up in Dublin and basically said, right, we need to define Irish whiskey. Let's define it exactly how we make it. And, we're really, really big businesses, so this is how we make it. This is how we make pot still. This is the definition of it. That's the end of it. Good night. Shut the door. Send it off to the EU, basically. And that happened, and then all of these guys came on the scene. And this is particularly an irksome piece for the Irish whiskey industry because of the tradition of single pot still whiskey in Ireland, right? Single pot still is unique. It kind of began in Ireland. It's something we can really kind of hang our hat on. And it's defined in this document as a way, it's defined in a non-traditional way, I would say. It's defined in a way that a particular company was making it at the time. And there's a lot of small guys now who are coming back and bringing the industry back and are going back into archives and are going back into published recipes from like the 1700s of pot still that they want to bring back and they want to market as pot still Irish whiskey because it is traditional Irish whiskey from the 1700s, but they're not allowed to because the definition has been set by somebody else who makes it a particular way. So I guess the point there is that traditional and legislation can sometimes sort of butt heads, and it's not always a good outcome. Legislation is an absolutely necessary evil for all of us, but it doesn't always go exactly how you want it to go, particularly when an industry is in the middle of resurgence. The other big issue with this file is transparency. So because I'm a whiskey bonder, I don't distill. I never will. So I have a responsibility then to be hyper transparent about what I'm doing, and I really take that personally. Transparency is a bugbear of mine. I just think it's very damaging to not be transparent, and I feel very protective about the Irish whiskey industry because we're at a very kind of difficult point at the moment in that the industry is being reborn, and if we don't kind of stay on the straight and narrow and tell the truth and be transparent, we're going to set ourselves back again. We're just getting out of the traps here. So this particular document, the technical file, doesn't really allow you to be very transparent. But when I founded my business and I released my first whiskey, nothing was legislated. It was like really early on. So I decided to test the water on transparency, and I decided to be 100% transparent on my labels. So this is the first thing whiskey we ever released. It's called the Gale, and it's a blend. It's a 60% malt, 40% grain blend. And we use some of our older stocks in here. So, I source new make, but I also source mature stocks as well. And I decided I would write on my label everything that was in the whiskey. So it's 5% 26-year-old, 27.5% 15-year-old, 27.5% 11-year-old, and then the remainder is 7-year-old grain. And but it was really clear, and I put it on the label, and I put a pie chart on the back so you could see what was in it. And this whiskey costs $80. So I feel a responsibility to my consumer to inform them as to what's in it. And I said I'd go by the book, so I then submitted the label to 4 governmental bodies. You guys think the TTB is a problem? I had to submit it to the Department of Agriculture, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, the Health Service Executive, and the Revenue, two revenues. And I sent the label off and I was like, I'm releasing this whiskey, guys. Is everything cool? Here it is. And then all of the departments kicked it around and around and around and around. And they said, yeah, it's fine. Just release it. So I released it. And everybody thought it was great because it was really transparent. And then I got a letter from the Irish Whisky Association saying they were going to take me to court and recall all my product. Because that label, according to the current legislation, is misleading to the consumer. And it's misleading to the consumer because you're only allowed, according to EU Regulation 110/2008, you're only allowed to list the youngest component of the blend. You are not allowed to choose to be completely transparent. But because I did this, legally this is misleading to the consumer. So I got really angry and I joined the Irish Whisky Association and I was going to orchestrate for change on the inside. And then I gave up and I changed my label. And because I have a business to run, I can't do that. And so I changed my label to this. So if we go back between the two. So this is considered to be a transparent label. And this one is considered to be misleading to consumers. So the point being, legislation sometimes isn't great, particularly when it's kind of misguided in that regard. So when we brought back whiskey bonding, the whole piece around tradition and kind of moving it forward, it would have been very easy for me to just go and buy bulk liquid in an IBC and then send it to a bottler and then say, I'm a whiskey bonder, isn't it great? And I didn't want to do that. Being a whiskey bonder is not a marketing construct. I have a big multinational background, but I'm honest at heart, and I didn't want bonding just to be a marketing construct. I wanted it to be a real thing, and it needed to stand for something. So there is no regulation around bonding or anything. It was completely lost. So everything that we do kind of has to stand for something. It has to be, we have to redefine or define this tradition for modern times, essentially.
That's Louise McGuane of Ireland's Chapel Gate Whiskey Company, speaking at the recent World Whisky Forum in Seattle, with some thoughts about Irish whiskey that should spark some discussion within the whiskey community. That's WhiskyCast In Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. And, of course, it makes sense to look at some Irish whiskies this time around. Let's start with a new single cask bottling from Kilbeggan. It's a 19-year-old single-grain whiskey that was distilled at Cooley from a mash of 96% corn and 4% malted barley. Buyers from the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board tasted it and bought the entire barrel. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is light and clean, with notes of honey, vanilla, and just a hint of oak. The taste is creamy with sweet corn, black pepper, allspice, and touches of honey and butterscotch in the background. The finish, long and sweet with just a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Kilbeggan 19-year-old single grain, a 91. By the way, I'll have tasting notes for the new Kilbeggan single pot still whiskey soon at whiskycast.com. I found a sample waiting for me when I got home from New Zealand this week. I just haven't had a chance to taste it yet. We heard from Hinch Distillery's Michael Morris earlier. I had the chance to taste the initial release of Hinch Single Pot Still. It's bottled at 43% ABV, and the nose has subtle touches of baking spices, along with honey and vanilla. The taste has nice notes of clove, cinnamon, anise, allspice, and hints of tree fruits, honey, and vanilla in the background. The finish is medium length with gently fading spices. I'm scoring the Hinch Single Pot Still Whiskey an 88. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute. This week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Glendalough Distillery has released a new, unique single-pot still Irish whiskey. It's one of the few that's finished in Irish oak, and in this case, the trees came from forests near the distillery in County Wicklow. It's bottled at 45% ABV. The nose is buttery and smooth with gentle spices, hints of dried fruits, vanilla, and oak. The taste, dark and oaky, with touches of licorice, anise, oak tannins, and just a hint of molasses, along with soft baking spices and just a touch of honey in the background. The finish is long, dark, and oaky. Usually when someone uses words like unique and interesting in a review, that's a lot like saying a blind date has a great personality. In this case, though, the whiskey really does have a unique character, and while it may not be for everyone's taste, I'm scoring the Glendalough Single Pot Still Irish Oak finish a 92. Now, while I was in New Zealand last week, Redbreast unveiled its new 27-year-old port cask enhanced single pot still whiskey in Dublin. If you heard last week's episode from Christchurch, you might remember that my business partner and the managing director of Cask Strength Media, Christina Filburn, was at that launch event. Let's just say that I had to wait until someone's suitcase was unpacked to get my hands on a sample. But it was well worth the wait. It's bottled at 54.6% ABV. The nose is fruity with lots of raspberry jam, red grapes, hints of apricots, muted spices, and black cherries, along with a gentle oakiness. The taste is fruity, vibrant, and luscious, with an explosion of fresh berries, black cherries, apricots, and plums, balanced nicely by soft baking spices and a hint of oak tannins. The finish, long, intense, and fruity. Let's be honest, Redbreast has been a WhiskyCast sponsor for many years now, and I've had the chance to taste a lot of Redbreast whiskeys over that time. This one could be my favorite yet, with the possible exception of the original Redbreast Dream Cask a couple of years ago. That one was one of the few whiskeys I've ever scored 98 points. As for the Redbreast 27-year-old, I'm giving it a 97. Yeah, it's that good. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Heard from Mark at WTF in South Africa on Twitter this week with a non-coronavirus question. Hey Mark, what's the latest news re the TTB looking to do away with standard bottle sizes? Are you guys going to do away with 75 CL anytime soon? That brings up a story we reported on in early 2019 after the Tax and Trade Bureau here in the U.S. opened up a proposal to eliminate most of the so-called standards of fill when it comes to bottle sizes for whiskeys and other distilled spirits. I've had a couple of similar questions in the last few weeks, and heard back from TTB spokesman Thomas Hogue while I was in New Zealand last week on both the standards of fill proposal and the much larger rewrite of federal alcohol regulations that came out at the end of 2018. He says the agency is working to move forward as quickly as possible on what he calls burden-reducing proposals that have broad support and consensus from industry. However, the TTB received more than 600 comments alone on the bottle size proposal, and Hogue says many commenters were in opposition. That proposal would have eliminated all but the minimum and maximum sizes for spirits bottles, and there was some opposition from the Distilled Spirits Council and consumer groups to throwing out all the mandated sizes in between for a number of reasons. We'll keep following this story. Now to some coronavirus comments. We're seeing bars and restaurants shut down in many U.S. states to keep the virus from spreading, and Pennsylvania is now shutting down its state-run liquor stores in 4 suburban Philadelphia counties where the outbreak has taken hold. Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf ordered the liquor stores closed, along with all other so-called non-essential businesses. That brought this comment from David Monahan at Serious About Play on Twitter. Non-essential? I beg to differ. At least it's not perishable. Stocked up today on wine, whiskey, and beer. I don't understand the lack of toilet paper, flour, and rice in the stores. I would have emptied the liquor stores first. But let's take this more seriously. As at WhiskyCat1324 noted on Twitter, you know that when measures like this are being taken, that there is a serious problem on the horizon. Stay safe. Amen to that. At Ranger Rick pointed this out on Twitter. Besides the cancellations, I'm not looking forward to how many small distilleries already struggling with the recent tariffs are just going to be destroyed by any dip in sales or traffic. Now, there was a coronavirus meme on Twitter this week that went something like this. You're stuck in quarantine for 14 days with the third person who pops up when you type the @ sign. Who are you quarantined with, and will both of you make it out alive? I really feel sorry for Sean Handley at Dramming UK. Here's what he tweeted. Looks like I'm in with WhiskyCast. I'm sure that'd be a very enjoyable 2 weeks. Let's put it this way, Sean. At a time when public officials are telling all of us to stay home and not go out in public, my family keeps urging me to go to the office. Now, I tried out that meme, and I know you're not going to believe this, but you know what came up third on my list when I typed the @ sign in a tweet? The Redbreast Whiskey Twitter account. I kid you not, gang. Tell us who you'd like to be quarantined with and what bottle of whiskey you'd take into the bunker with you, or whatever else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, except the coronavirus. You can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. At We Rock Whiskey in Canada had the following comment this weekend on Twitter. I feel like whiskey events should be allowed to continue, as we are essentially consuming hand sanitizer, especially if it is the cask strength stuff. Well, let's be realistic for a minute. We are not essentially consuming hand sanitizer. In fact, the makers of Tito's handmade vodka had to issue a news release the other day telling people that their vodka is not an acceptable hand sanitizer. And I'm not going to make any vodka jokes here. The real reason is that Tito's is bottled at 40% ABV. The Centers for Disease Control recommends that we use hand sanitizers that contain at least 60% alcohol. Commercial hand sanitizers are made with what is usually called denatured alcohol, and yes, they are made with ethyl alcohol, which is the same thing that gives our whiskeys their punch. However, it's that denaturing part that you've got to watch out for. That's where the makers put additives in it that make it taste and smell bad, along with stuff like methanol, which is one of the lighter alcohols that evaporates early in the distilling process as part of the heads or foreshots part of making whiskey. Methanol is also the stuff that can make you go blind if you drink too much of it. Now, those additives aren't put in there because they help make a more effective hand sanitizer. The reason they're used is because denatured alcohol is not taxed nearly as much as whiskeys and other alcoholic beverages are. If it was something that you could actually consume without being poisoned, people would drink it instead. Now, is there any reason why a whiskey distillery couldn't make some hand sanitizer on the side? Not at all, as long as they clear it with the Tax and Trade Bureau first because of the tax issues involved. We got word this weekend that is exactly what Hotel Tango Spirits in Indianapolis, Indiana is doing. They've started producing hand sanitizer using a denatured version of the spirit off their stills. And as soon as they get federal approval, they'll donate the first 2,000 bottles to shelters in Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. It's being made in a separate quarantined area from their regular distilling operations. Old Fourth Distillery in Atlanta is also making hand sanitizer from its new make spirit and giving it away for free to people who stop by with an empty bottle. According to CBS News, 600 people did just that this Friday alone. And the Shine Distillery and Grill in Portland, Oregon is also making hand sanitizer and giving it away. What's more, they'll even share their recipe with other craft distillers who want to help out. Now, we should point out the Centers for Disease Control still recommends good old soap and water for killing germs and viruses when you wash your hands. Hand sanitizer is the next best thing. It doesn't kill all germs and viruses. But you have to remember, hand sanitizer only works on your skin, not when taken orally. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. We have links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast tasting panel and the WhiskyCast HD video series. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the whiskey photo of the week, the calendar of events, and, of course, a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments at whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and keep washing your hands.